So far in the book of Esther, we have seen God's providence shine like a diamond's brilliance. Like the glorious glare of the different angles of a diamond, so is God's silent sovereignty seen with each turn of events in the kingdom. From the removal of Vashti as queen to the initiative to find a new one with a decree, all of these randomly moving parts are deemed to be divinely hidden plots. Not only is this true with Esther being made queen, but it's also seen when Mordecai discovers a plot to kill the king. Then there is Haman's wicked scheme to annihilate all the Jews. Little does he know that Queen Esther is one too. So out of the many lessons we have learned thus far in Esther, it is apparent how the Lord's providence moves like chess, not checkers. From the king's sleepless night to Haman's gallows being made overnight, both happenings would prove God's timing is always right. You see, no weapon formed against God's people will prosper. This means that with every dark backdrop comes the setting for the diamond of the gospel. This is Esther, silent sovereignty.
All right, so we're going to move rather quickly. We're in the book of Esther, as you just heard. We're at chapter 6 and even chapter 7. Chapter 6, chapter 7 are the culmination of the entire book. It's where the tables are turning. It's where the tide is shifting. We've covered a lot of ground. We've highlighted a lot of themes. Two main themes from an aerial view. So as a Bible student, as a disciple of Jesus Christ, a book like Esther is a narrative, tells a story. But what are the main themes? From the aerial view, you have to get this. There are macro and micro lessons. From the aerial view, it's about God's providence. God's providence, best defined as he takes what is natural and he uses it supernaturally. So it's the everyday, mundane of life that God is providentially using for his glory. But his providence needs a witness. So if providence was paint and his faithfulness was the frame, are you recognizing whether it's the good, the bad, or the ugly? All of it has a purpose in God's economy, right? We know that as New Testament believers, Romans 8:28, Old Testament information in the book of Joseph, Genesis 50, verse 20, all of which is useful to God according to his economy. Now, providence needs a witness. So the second theme, it's on the micro level, is that God never leaves himself without a witness. In any given context, throughout the ages, he always places his people or a person in a certain setting, like that diamond and the glorious glare on the black backdrop of a velvet. That witness is going to point to God's goodness, God's faithfulness. No matter where you read in the Bible, you will see God never leaves himself without a witness. Why is that important? Psalm 103 verse 19 says, the Lord has established his throne in heaven. That's his authority. And yet his kingdom rules over all. His kingdom is ruling within the realm of man. From Genesis to Revelation, it's the kingdom of light versus the kingdom of darkness. It's good as God defines it versus evil. It's righteousness versus wickedness. All of that is the driving thread through the Bible. And yet, as we stop at a certain period with the Persians ruling the known world, we're introduced to a Jewish girl, an orphan, as we learn, raised by her cousin, who's a stepfather of sorts, named Mordecai, placed right there in a foreign kingdom as captives, and God is going to do a work, not only to spare his people, but so that the promise of his kingdom can continue. But it doesn't happen so easy. Never does. Just as God is accomplishing his will, there's an enemy who is seeking to circumvent God's will. He is seeking to establish his ways. He's seeking to pervert God's truth. There's always Haman. Haman is the antagonist. We are introduced to him in chapter 3. Haman is adversarial. Haman is harnessed by hell, as you will learn. His plot, his plan, his scheme to annihilate the Jews, little does he know that God is setting the stage and he is going to reverse hell's verdict on the Jews, and he's going to recycle the devil's schemes, and that is the vein by which God produces his truth, his gospel, his good news. So as we stop and we pause and we consider where we're at in our day and age and how the Lord is still providentially working and he's still looking for his witnesses. Are you his witness? Where he has placed you in your context? Are you willing to testify to his goodness? Are you telling others about Jesus? What is a subpoena? I hope nobody in this room knows what a subpoena is by firsthand experience, but it's a written note or declaration that you need to report to court. And usually, if you are a recipient of a subpoena, you have to report to court to be a witness. And what I'm here to tell you as a minister of a subpoena is that God is asking you to report to court and testify as his witness, to steal the line from Esther chapter 4, for such a time as this. And yes, church, the spirit of Haman will absolutely be working counter to that mission. Sometimes Haman is behind the leader as a handler. I can only imagine how many Hamans are handling the current administration. Sometimes Haman is the leader like Hitler. Regardless, whether they're behind the scenes, whether they're at the forefront of the scene, they use the political veins and streams to accomplish hell's bidding. So let's go back before Esther, Daniel. God never leaves himself without a witness, with a king named Nebuchadnezzar and then Cyrus, both pagan kings, unrighteous rulers, used by God to accomplish his righteous rule. And then we are introduced to Esther and Mordecai in the midst of an ungodly context. Yet God never leaves himself without a witness. Fast forward beyond the days of Esther, and we're introduced to a man named Nehemiah, again with the Persian Empire and King Artaxerxes, which would be the son of the king in Esther. Xerxes' son Artaxerxes would find favor with Nehemiah and allow him to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls, to accomplish God's will, to spare the holy seed that would eventually lead to the arrival of Jesus Christ, born of a virgin in Bethlehem, as prophesied, to be the ultimate witness, the true witness, the ultimate deliverer for such a time as this. Insert the church age, which is the age you and I are a part of right here, right now, as a witness to testify about Jesus. And all of these things that are happening, seen and unseen, are controlled by God's sovereignty. And his providence, if you begin to notice it, sets you up to speak about his work, his way, and his will. Do you recognize it? Remember where we've been in Esther so far. The previous chapter titled Holding Court. And the reason why we entitled it Holding Court is because Esther is about to make her way into King Ahasuerus' court. And if he doesn't find favor upon her in that moment, it's her life. But he sees her from a distance, and he raises that golden scepter. She is able to approach him, touching the scepter as a sign of submission, asking her what it is she requested. So now she's holding court with him. And she says, I want to have a banquet with you and Haman. The king summons Haman. Mind you, Haman is the one that conspired to have the plot and the decree to annihilate the Jews. The king himself has no idea that the people who are subjected to this decree are the Jews. He has no clue that his very own queen is Jewish. As you see, the plot is thickening. What is it you request, Queen Esther? She says, I want to have another banquet, but the next day. To which the king honors that request. Haman leaves, feeling joy and gladness that the queen and the king would want to have a banquet with just him. Who does he see? Mordecai. And all of that glee and that gladness, it literally evaporates and he's filled with wrath. And he goes home, and what does he do? He holds court with his wife and his friends. He talks about all that he has, wealth. He has power and prominence, but it all amounts to nothing, he says. So long as that Jew, Mordecai, is allowed to live. He gets excellent advice from his wife. Build some gallows, ask the king for his head, and put it behind you. Then go off gladly to the banquet. So the night falls. Haman builds the gallows. Esther retires to her quarters. The next day is a big day. She's going to reveal who it is that is responsible for this decree to kill her people. And the king goes to his room. Esther 6, verse 1. That night the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" And the king's servants who attended to him said, "Nothing has been done for him." Now, this would take you back to the end of chapter 2. It's where Mordecai was in an earshot to a plot, an assassination attempt to kill the king. He reports it to his stepdaughter, his cousin Esther, who's the queen. She tells the king in the name of, very important, in the name of Mordecai, of this plot. It's verified. It's probably, as we discover here, documented. The Persians took exceptional notes to every happening within the kingdom, and it was a vast kingdom. Chapter 3 begins, but it's not Mordecai who is the recipient of honor. It's Haman, the mortal enemy of the Jews. It's as if the writer of the narrative is showing you that the king neglects to honor Mordecai, and for some reason honors Haman. And if you're Mordecai, do you feel some type of way? See, it was common for the kings in the Persian Empire to lavish great reward upon anyone who showed loyalty to the king. An oversight, a miss. Look at me. Until 5 years later, which is how much time has passed between chapter 2 and chapter 6. 5 years. And the point is absolutely clear. In God's economy, delays are not denials, but divine arrivals. And some of you here today are praying about certain things, and you think that God has denied it, and you feel a compulsion to keep praying about it. And I'm saying to you, God has not denied it. He may just be delaying it. And at the perfect time, at the right time, at the divine time, he is going to allow it to be answered, or the door to be opened, or the circumstance to find a purpose. This is remarkable. I want you to think through, in the middle of the night, the king can't sleep. And instead of calling a musician from his court to try to play soothing music, which was common, to get him lulled back to sleep, or maybe calling a concubine from his harem to come into his room, which was common, neither option were chosen. No, go read me a book. Now, just to let you know, there are 127 provinces. There are millions of people. These books are not only extensive, likely 100 years worth of Persian chronicles, Persian history. And out of all the books in that library, the attendant, he grabs just one. By chance, we would call it. And out of all of the records kept in that book, at this point, King Ahasuerus is reigning for about 10 years. 10 years, perhaps, worth of content about his reign. By the way, it's like reading a phone book to be put back to sleep. Out of all the chapters, out of all the dates, the attendant turns to a date 5 years earlier. But not just any date. Out of all the records to read, he begins to read about the time when a guy named Mordecai discovered a plot that saved the king's life. Providence. Perfectly provided. The king couldn't sleep, which was a doing by God as well. Now, I do not recommend, by the way, in light of the attendant picking a certain book out of many and opening up to a certain place, and it was exactly what the king needed to hear, because the very next day we'll discover Haman's going to come and request Mordecai's head. So God was waking the king up to clue him in about a guy who needs favor and who's going to need honor. But I do not recommend, by the way, people have done this. It may work sometimes, but I do not recommend it. Grabbing the Bible and just going, all right, Lord, here we go. Matthew 27:5, and Judas went and hung himself. Let's try that again. Luke 10:37, go and do likewise. Yeah, don't do that. Don't do that. There's a lesson here, even as we consider how God woke the king up and the exact chronicles that needed to be read were in reference to a present event that was about to happen. And I kind of want to stop here and kind of press in, because how many of us have sleepless nights? And based on the Bible, I want to orient my heart and my mind and even my restlessness in the middle of the night to say, Lord, why can't I sleep? Who am I supposed to be praying about right now? What do you want me to hear or see or know in the middle of the night? And I know it's hard, but I would say, instead of counting sheep, in the middle of the night, learn to count on the shepherd, which is what Pastor Matt Glancy shared last week, the good shepherd. So next time that you can't sleep at night, I'm confident enough to say maybe the Lord is trying to get you to know something. Or maybe somebody's out there that is praying for you to not be able to sleep. And I know what that's like too. In fact, I wasn't going to share this illustration, but it was appropriate because taken from this exact account, Daniel chapter 6, verse 1, and it was something that happened very intimately to my family. And I was looking through my email and trying to find the document that was sent to me years ago, and I couldn't find it no matter what search I did. And then it dawned on me, this very document that I was looking for was inserted into a book, a chronicles of sorts. So I went upstairs and I found the book, and it was written by my mom, and I literally was like, it's gotta be in here. And I turned to the first few pages, because I imagine that's where it's at, because it's early on in the narrative, and I turned directly to the page, no lie, just like I just did, page 7. And it was when my mother and my father put out a prayer request before I would be sentenced to prison in January of 2010. And the prayer request involves several different layers, but this is what I wanted to hone in on. My mother and father requested that family and friends pray for my victim's family, Mr. Hortcat, that they might be consoled and see Christ in the midst of their pain through our witness to them, that they extend forgiveness to Matthew and see a greater purpose in the tragedy that happened. And finally, please hold Judge Michael Donio and Prosecutor Ted Housel in special prayer, as Matt's complete life profile has been placed in their hands, like a chronicles of sorts. And we know the ultimate decision is in your hands, Proverbs 16:9. Who turns the hearts of men whichever way he pleases? That happened. I am praying the same scenario as found in the book of Esther, chapter 6. That night the king could not sleep, so he commanded the book of the records of the chronicles be read to him, and it was found written a plot against the king. The story goes on to show how God's perfect timing in intervening for his people and how he works in the hearts of men. So this is the prayer that was requested upon family and friends. May Judge Donio not be able to sleep that night after reading the history of Matthew's life. May he be so troubled in soul and spirit that he feels compelled to exercise supernatural judgment accompanied by mercy. Would you know that the very first statement he made before his decision was, there are certain cases that you preside over that keep you up at night. And he proceeded with such wisdom to discern what was happening in this situation. And that was enough for my family to hear and go, this is what we prayed for. I just want to encourage you to know that no matter what it is, God is providentially working behind the scenes. As this unfolds, watch what happens. Verse 4, it happens quick. So the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. The king's servant said to him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." Listen, Haman woke up extra early that morning. He has no idea that the king was restless and requested the chronicles, which would reveal a plot, which would highlight a man named Mordecai. So when you put this together, Haman is coming early in the morning with Mordecai on his heart, going to ask for the murder of this guy. And yet the king has Mordecai on his heart in reference to honor the guy. And those two worlds are about to collide. Of course, the king needs to know what type of honor should be bestowed upon someone who would honor the king in such a way. So where are my advisors, he asked. Is there anybody in the courtyard? And of course they say, Haman's in the courtyard. Now here comes Haman, probably has his files and his notebook ready to explain why the king should approve the hanging of one named Mordecai. And if you're not catching the precision of providence, you got to understand something. God's providence, never early. God's providence, never tardy. God's providence, always timely. Can you imagine this? Before he can speak, the king is going to speak. Verse 6, so Haman came in and the king asked him, "What shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?" Before Haman can speak, before he can tell the king while he's there, the king asks him, "What should be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought in his heart, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" Hey, this is one of those verses that are overlooked that show us this is inspired by God. Because the writer, whoever it is, we don't know, would not have access to the thoughts of a heart unless the Spirit tells him in that moment, Haman's pride in his heart suggests, who in this kingdom would the king want to honor more than me? I'm the man. And yet God is arranging Haman's self-inflation to backfire to his own humiliation. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 12, get this. Before destruction, the heart of a man is haughty, and before honor is humility. Jesus would say something very similar in Matthew 23, verse 12. He said, "Those that exalt themselves will be humbled, and those that humble themselves will be lifted up or exalted." And in this equation, you see you have two options. The first option is to humble yourself. Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. To submit and humble ourselves under God's mighty hand. So here's how it goes. Like Haman, like Mordecai, these are the two examples. You can choose humility today, or humiliation will choose you. You're not getting away from that. Oh, I know that in a very real way in my life. To choose humility, or to eventually have humiliation choose you. We continue, verse 7, and Haman answered the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head like a crown. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square and proclaim before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" This was in Haman's heart. Now, when you really think about what he's asking for, it all amounts to nothing. At the end of the parade, the robe would be returned, and so would the horse. And the applause of man would fade. But it just shows you what pride accomplishes in a heart. I'll tell you what it does. When the chest swells, the brain shrinks. Egotism is the epitome of folly. This is what he requested, thinking this is what was going to be lavished upon him. He wanted to be the king. I want the king's robe, the king's crown, the king's horse. I want people to honor me as I'm paraded through the community. It's quite ironic that the prideful man lives for human applause, not heaven's approval. Want to see a prideful man or a prideful woman? They're constantly living for human applause, acceptance, affirmation, not heaven's approval. And the king said to Haman, hurry. Can you imagine this? Hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits in the king's gate, leaving nothing undone of all that you have spoken out of your mouth. So Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Are you catching this whiplash? Can you imagine? His heart said, this is how I want to be honored. And the king says, great idea. You're my most noblest prince. Take what you've said and honor Mordecai the Jew. Don't miss this. Haman was coming in to request Mordecai's head. Now he's going to leave and place a crown on Mordecai's head. It's a complete reversal to a verdict that Haman came to the day before with his wife and his friends. I don't know how long that moment lasted, how far they paraded Mordecai, how many times Haman had to say the refrain, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. I can only imagine every time he said it. Can you imagine what he was feeling on the inside? Can you imagine how awkward it was for Mordecai, knowing the guy that is parading him around the community signed a decree that would eventually annihilate his people, and here he is kind of confused, but maybe, just maybe, he's beginning to see the turn of events and how their praying and their fasting was heard by God. And he knew this much, that his cousin Esther had not told the king about the plan because she delayed it a day. And now this is happening. Now, let's kind of juxtapose Haman and Mordecai, because verse 12 tells us, afterward, Mordecai went back to the king's gate. Can I be honest? I'm not going back to work after that happens. I'm going home. I'm telling all my family, all my friends. But just one verse gives us a picture of Mordecai's humble heart. Now, I might be reading too much into the verse, but think about it. He gets honored throughout the community, and he goes directly back to where he was before it happened. Where does Haman go? He hurries home, mourning and with his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men, here he is holding court again, and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, the holy seed, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. You got to see how many things are happening at the same time. Remember, the entire account in chapter 4 begins with the Jews mourning, fasting, weeping, in anguish. Here Haman is mourning and weeping in seeming self-anguish. You see the day before the plot from his wife and friends to kill Mordecai. Here's what you'll do, build gallows and kill him. And now the same people, the wife and the friends, are saying, oh no, if the guy you were just parading throughout the community is a Jew and the king is favoring him like that, you have no hope. The first plan was to kill Mordecai. Now they're telling him, no, Mordecai's going to kill you. Remember the day before they said, hey, after your plan succeeds and the king approves the gallows, go merrily, was the word, to the banquet with the queen. Look what happens in verse 14. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring him to the banquet. You better believe he's not going merrily. You better believe he's going miserably. All of his plots, his schemes, and his plans are literally crashing before him. Is that not the case with the devil's plans and his minions and their devices. In Job chapter 5, verse 12 and 13, here's the truth. He, God, frustrates the devices of the crafty so that their hands cannot carry out their plans. He catches the wise in their own craftiness, and the counsel of the cunning comes quickly upon them. The counsel of the cunning? Yeah, those that connive. 1 Corinthians 3:19, pulled from that very verse in Job, Paul would write, "For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God, for it is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness." Those that are plotting and scheming and conniving, the conniver actually thinks they are tying a knot on their plans, but they're really just tying a noose. The enemies of God think they're tying a beautiful bow on their plans and their bills and their decrees and their policies. And in God's economy, they're really just tying a noose around their own necks. Chapter 7 begins, and it happens all so quickly. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. Now, this is Haman, the queen, and the king. On the second day at the banquet of the wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Up to half the kingdom." That's a hyperbole. He's just basically saying, "I'll give you whatever you ask. It shall be done." Then Queen Esther answered and said, she repeats what she said the day before, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king," there's tact here. She's being very careful. "Let my life be given me at my petition." She's making it personal. "And my people at my request." The king has to be confused. Verse 4, "For we have been sold," she says, "my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue." And then she kind of brings it back to, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. You got to understand, the king's disoriented at this point. He's got his trusted advisor, Haman. He's got his queen. What would you want? Up to half the kingdom. She then says, "My life and my people's life." The king's mind has to start figuring out, what is she talking about? Does he immediately know that he signed a decree conspired by Haman? We discover he does not know it was the Jews that decree was aimed at. The way Esther frames this is beautiful. Why? Because the day before, she didn't get this far. And she even references in what she's saying now about holding her tongue. And I was like, that's pretty cool, because the day before she held her tongue, so to speak. For whatever reason, the Holy Spirit was like, no, pause, don't say it just yet. Why? Because the night had to unfold, and the king had to be awakened from his sleep and request the chronicles and read about Mordecai, who he sought to honor as Haman's coming in to ask for his head. It's a perfect storm, and God is the one providentially working behind the scenes. And I just love the lesson here. Now's the time to speak, Esther. In our own lives, having the discernment to know the difference is hard. But there is a time to hold your tongue, and there is a time when your tongue holds you. Do you know the difference? Ecclesiastes says there's a time to speak and a time to be silent. There's these two proverbs. I hate them. It's chapter 26. Read through Proverbs 26, and you'll run into this. It says this: "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him." Okay, hold my tongue. The very next verse: "Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes." And I don't know which one is which. Sometimes I speak when I shouldn't speak. Sometimes I don't speak when I should speak. I think the Holy Paul is saying, Lord, if I've prepared my heart, then you are responsible for the answer of my tongue. So if I take a moment and allow the weight of the moment to either cause me to wait and hold my tongue or cause me to speak as God would have it. Interesting point. God is using this in Esther's life. 24 hours have passed, and this is what happens in verse 5. "So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, 'Who is he? Where is he? Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?'" The king is violent at this point. And can you imagine? Maybe they're sitting at a long table. I don't know. I had a little bit of skin on the commentary. "Where is he?" Can you see Esther going like this? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Oh. You know, if the morning events had completely humiliated Haman, he may have recharged his pride, knowing he was summoned to the banquet on behalf of the queen and the king. So in this moment, he's in the presence of royalty, the king and the queen, and he was maybe able to put behind him what just happened with Mordecai and what his wife said and what his friends said. And he's probably in this moment listening to Esther frame her thoughts about something's happening in my life. And he's starting to make the connection. No way! Can the queen be a Jew? Can the queen be a Jew? Yes, because God never leaves himself without a witness. We were introduced to Haman in chapter 3. Haman was honored. We've watched Haman humiliated. And in verse 6, Haman is horrified. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Watch how quickly this swings back on him. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. Verse 8, when the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman, perfect timing, had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, will he also assault the queen while I am in the house? As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Are you catching the irony here? This whole thing began because one Jew named Mordecai would not bow to Haman. And now you're seeing Haman, the one who wanted to kill the Jews, bowing before a Jew, pleading and begging for his life. And out of all the times the king could have returned, he goes out into the court. When he comes back, the precision of Providence. This is when Haman is throwing himself upon the queen. This enrages the king even more, instantly covering his face. Verse 9, now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, look. Now, however this knowledge came to Harbona, it was public knowledge at this point, at least with the advisory board and the eunuchs, they're aware. Look, the gallows, 50 cubits high, 70 plus feet, which Haman made for Mordecai less than 24 hours earlier, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. What did we quote from Isaiah? A couple hundred years before this, no weapon formed against God's people will prosper. The weapons formed by God's allowance will not prosper by God's providence. Haman is honored, he's humiliated, he's horrified, and here he's hanged. Proverbs 26:27, whoever digs a pit will fall into it, and he who rolls a stone will have it roll back on him. Weapons formed for the believer become blessings for. And you have to learn to frame your faith around that truth. Because there are things that happen in life that are hard, that are oppressive, that are evil. But you got to understand God has allowed it for a reason, for a season. And he's likely going to recycle it. And it all has a purpose in his economy. Don't believe me? Let's ask Joseph. It was the brothers' malice that placed him in the palace. No weapon formed without becoming a blessing for. Let's ask Daniel. They lied on him. Their lying led him to the lions. The same king, Darius, who signed a decree that you can't pray to anyone but himself, is the same king who goes and checks on Daniel and brings him out and signs a second decree that says Daniel's God is the one true God. No weapon formed will prosper. And ultimately, those examples pale in comparison to Jesus. Oh, the cross. That was the very ploy and plot of the devil himself, trying to kill off the promised son, the seed of Eve, the Messiah, the Christ. And God ordained it. And it was the greatest evil ever done, God on a cross And it was the very weapon formed that became the greatest blessing for. And Paul, the apostle, would write to the church, the Colossians, he would say in chapter 2, verse 14 and 15, hey, the handwriting of requirements that are against you, your charges, are pinned to the cross. And oh, by the way, all of the powers and principalities and the rulers and the politicians and the religious leaders, they've all been disarmed based on the work of the cross. In fact, God made a public spectacle, like a parade, out of it all. And that's exactly what Proverbs 11:8 says. Right? In the case of Haman and Mordecai, the righteous are delivered from trouble. Mordecai is delivered from trouble, and it comes upon the wicked instead. Haman takes his place. Final thoughts. That's not necessarily what happens with us. What do I mean? No, it's reverse. In the case of Jesus, the righteous took the place of the wicked. And if we don't see the gospel that way, that like Barabbas, who's on trial for actual murder and insurrection, he deserves to be on that cross, yet he became the people's choice. And he's set free, having his debt paid, so to speak, to go on his way. And I'm saying, how many of us have lived a life like Barabbas, where Christ has paid our debt? We deserve the death that he took. The innocent, the righteous for the wicked. And that is why before I see the cross as something done for me, ladies and gentlemen, I need to see the cross as something done by me. Before you can ever see the cross as something accomplished for you, you must own and accept the cross was something done by you. Your sin, my sin, and yet Christ chose to pay that sin debt in full. So as we come to a close here, in light of chapter 6 and 7, and how these verdicts are reversed in God's economy, all of that means nothing if you don't know Jesus. Is there anyone amongst us here today that has never given their life to Christ, never owned their sinfulness, and thanked Jesus for taking their place? Is there anyone here amongst us? Anyone under the sound of my voice, anyone within the administration of this word? If that's you, I would ask you to do something bold. Take a stand, raise your hand. Anybody has never given their life to the Lord? Anyone? You do not know where you stand with Christ. Your sin has placed him on that cross 2,000 years ago, but he chose it because his love and his grace are greater than your greatest sins and your shames. Anyone amongst us? The Lord knows, right? Let's pray. Father, in the name of Jesus, thank you for these people before me, those that are even watching online, those that will have access to this message thereafter. Pray that your word is clear, that hearts are convicted to know you more, to understand your providence, to understand that you've placed us here as your witness, to testify to your goodness, to know that no weapon formed against us will prosper, to know that in your economy, all the good, all the bad, all the ugly has a divine purpose to make us more like Jesus, so we receive that. God, allow this place of grace to be exactly that. People would come to know who you are on a deeper plane, in a deeper way. So we sing to you now an anthem that your cause would be how we live, and your cause would be worth even dying for. Bless your people this week in the name of Christ. Amen.